Okay, here is part 2 of our first video lecture. We're still in chapter 6. We had been looking at the problems of the country under the Articles of Confederation, and now we're going to turn to the creation of the Constitution of the United States. So we know that the country was drifting toward disaster under the Articles. The government was too weak, it was bankrupt, the states were beginning to throw up trade barriers against each other, tariffs and taxes on commerce crossing state lines. You had all sorts of problems that the central government could not fix, and in many ways the states were making worse. And despite pleas from people like Alexander Hamilton and the state of Massachusetts to do something to fix these problems, most states, most politicians could not muster the will to actually try to strengthen the Articles of Confederation. So the country is beginning to slide toward disaster, but even in that kind of environment, there are always people who have vision, who are looking to find ways to make money. And one of the ideas that was floating around in the mid-1780s was the dream of building a canal that would connect the head of navigation on the Potomac River to the head of navigation on the Ohio River. So this canal would cross the mountains sort of along the same route that General Braddock had followed early in the French and Indian War. And if you could build this very complex project, and you were able to charge people, a fee to use that canal, you could make a lot of money because, in essence, you would have created an all-water route from the Atlantic Ocean all the way to the Mississippi River, and it would become a major artery of trade, perhaps the major artery of trade on the North American continent. The difficulty with building this canal is that it would have touched on the territory of Maryland and Pennsylvania and Virginia as states, and the territories of Kentucky and Ohio as well. And that's a lot of political jurisdictions, and that means you have a real problem. In an era where there were no national laws regulating trade, where the states were competing against each other more than they were cooperating with each other, the hurdles were simply too great to overcome. And so there was no way to build this canal and to make the money that building this canal would make you, unless you found some way for the states to act in greater harmony from an economic standpoint. And so the state of Virginia called for all of the other states in the Union to join it at a convention that would take place in Annapolis, Maryland, in early September of 1786 for the purposes of creating, quote, a unified system of commercial relations, unquote. In other words, this wasn't a call to fix the central government. This wasn't a plea to strengthen the Articles of Confederation, to enable the national government to better cope with the multitude of difficulties the country faced. This was simply a plea for the states to get together and figure out how they could develop a system under which it would be easier to make money. And of course, people are always more interested in making money than they are in trying to fix political problems. And despite that, only 5 states sent delegates to Annapolis. But the states that did, Virginia, Pennsylvania, New York, Maryland, were very important states, and some very prominent people showed up at this convention, which was held from September 11th to 14th in 1786. And while these men sat around and they tried to figure out a way to create this unified system of commercial relations, they confronted, ultimately, the key question: which comes first, political stability or economic prosperity? And that is not a difficult question to answer, because although there are always people who can find ways to make themselves rich in a destabilized environment, for the majority of people, you have to have political stability before you can have economic prosperity. This isn't a chicken and an egg question, which comes first. There is no doubt that it is the political stability that helps to breed the economic prosperity. And so what comes out of Annapolis is not a system of commercial relations. It is a plea to the Congress of the Confederation to call a convention of all the states to meet in the spring of 1787 to fix the Articles of Confederation and to render them adequate to the circumstances of the country. So that call goes out, and the question is, will anybody heed it? After all, the year before, in 1785, Massachusetts had asked all the states to come together for this express purpose, and Massachusetts had been ignored. And the odds, of course, are that this plea is going to be ignored. Even if the Congress of the Confederation makes it, why should you feel confident that all the states will send delegates? After all, Virginia had asked everybody to get together to figure out how we can make money, and only 5 out of 13 states had proven that they were willing to do that. So what are the odds? And the odds are not good. However, events served to intervene in such a way as to ensure that virtually every state participated in the proposed convention. And that event was something called Shays' Rebellion. Shays' Rebellion, which begins in August of 1786, but really hits its peak in January of 1787. Shays' Rebellion takes place in western Massachusetts, and it grows out of economic difficulties stemming from the Revolutionary War and a political divide in Massachusetts that was kind of common to every state. And that political divide springs from the fact that every state in the Union had been created basically from the beach inland. In other words, the first people to come over from England had settled along the shore. And as the colony became more populated, people moved deeper and deeper into the interior, so that by the time you have the creation of the United States, the eastern seaboard of every state is fairly heavily populated. It's fairly heavily developed. This is the oldest part of the state, so it's where the wealth tends to concentrate. It's where the best land is, so it's easy to have the big farms and the big plantations there. These are the established settlements, the oldest settlements. So this is not only where the wealth is, but it's where the center of the society is, and thus it's the center of political power. And in the western portion of every state, where the land isn't as good, where you have people who have more recently settled, there is not as much wealth, there's not quite the density of population, and therefore there is a lack of political power. So every state has this sort of east-west divide, with the east having the money and the power, and the west not having much money and not having much political power. And that was true in Massachusetts. And this becomes a problem in Massachusetts because Massachusetts is trying to pay its debt from the Revolutionary War. And to do that, the legislature enacts a new tax, and this is a tax on land. And because you're trying to raise revenue and you're trying to do it fairly quickly, this tax had to be paid in cash. It could not be paid in kind, which is how a lot of taxes were paid in that era, which means that you can't bring your chickens or your pigs or your cows and turn them over to the government and have the government sell those and raise the revenue. You actually have to pay in cash. Now, cash was going to be hard for everybody to come up with, but it was going to be much easier to do in the eastern portion of Massachusetts than in the western portion of Massachusetts. And so when the farmers of western Massachusetts, many of them veterans of the Revolutionary War, couldn't come up with the money, the courts began to foreclose on their farms and their homesteads for non-payment of taxes. And of course, to lose your farm was not only to lose your means of livelihood, it was to lose your residence, the place where your family lived, and in some instances, it was to lose your right to vote because there were property requirements in order to have the franchise. And for a lot of farmers in western Massachusetts and Revolutionary War veterans, this was simply intolerable. This was a government that was indifferent to them, that didn't care about them, that they thought was treating them unfairly, violating their rights, threatening their livelihoods, and taxing them unfairly. And so, led by people like Daniel Shay, who had been a captain in the Revolutionary Army, had fought at the Battle of Bunker Hill, they began to resist. And initially, the resistance came in the form of gangs of men getting together on court day at the county seat and physically stopping the courts from operating, stopping those foreclosures from happening, stopping the auctions from happening, roughing up or threatening government officials, this sort of stuff. Of course, this created quite the stir, something of a panic, and throughout the second half of the summer into the fall of 1786, the situation began to escalate. The rebels, under people like Shays, began to band together, and there was a real fear that they would stage a revolution, that they would overthrow the government of Massachusetts. And so the governor of Massachusetts decided to call out militia. In order to keep that from happening, he called out some 3,000 militiamen, put them under the command of General Benjamin Lincoln, who we remember from the siege of Charleston. He's the guy who accepted Cornwallis's sword and surrender at Yorktown. This militia was essentially from the eastern portion of the state, and they moved toward the arsenal in Springfield, Massachusetts, which was a government facility where you stockpiled arms and munitions and these sorts of things. And of course, it was something that the rebels very badly wanted. And so they were moving on the armory. Militiamen from the eastern portion of the state got there ahead of them. And on January 25th, there was a confrontation where Shays' militia tried to take the armory. The eastern militia fired on them, drove them away. Some people were shot, some people were hurt, and very quickly after that, really the Shays Rebellion fell apart. Nonetheless, this was a seminal moment in the history of the road to the Constitution, because it struck fear in the hearts of every government in the 13 colonies. It frightened a lot of people, and for good reason. I mean, ask yourself, what does this sound like? Some angry Massachusetts farmers believing that they are being treated unfairly by a distant government in which they are not adequately represented, that they are being taxed unfairly by a distant government in which they are not adequately represented, begin to push back by civil disobedience, by attacking government officials, and that this escalates suddenly into a clash of arms when one body of soldiers marches to seize military supplies, and another body of soldiers intervenes to keep those supplies from being captured. I mean, are we talking about Shays' Rebellion, or are we talking about Lexington and Concord? And of course, the parallels there are pretty startling. And this was something that happened in Massachusetts, which of course very quickly made amends, pardoned the rebels, did, sort of backtracked pretty quickly. Nonetheless, it sent a signal, because if this could happen in Massachusetts, it could happen in any colony, because this east-west divide existed in any colony. And a little surprise then that just a handful of weeks after the clash at the Springfield Arsenal, the Congress of the Confederation issued a call for a convention to convene in Philadelphia in May of 1787. In other words, it's Shays' Rebellion that convinced Congress to make the call, and it's Shays' Rebellion that convinced all of the states to send delegates. They may or may not have otherwise, and some of them likely would not have. But Shays' Rebellion frightened them. It frightened their citizens, and when people are frightened, they want action. They want to see government do something, and the thing that was on the table was this convention. And so delegates were elected and sent to Philadelphia. They would meet in the Pennsylvania State House, the same place that the Second Continental Congress had met, where the Declaration of Independence had been debated and voted on. It's known as Independence Hall. And it was not until May 25th of 1787 that there were enough of them there to form a quorum and begin to do business. And on that first day, the 55 delegates who would attend this convention undertook some very important steps. And one of the first things they did that would help ensure their ultimate success was to elect George Washington as the president of the convention. Washington was from Virginia. He was one of the Virginia delegates. You needed to have somebody to head the convention, to recognize speakers and make sure business was conducted, that sort of stuff. Washington was trustworthy. After all, he'd surrendered his commission as commander of the Continental Army as soon as the Treaty of Paris was ratified and gone back into private life. That had impressed everyone. All throughout the Revolutionary War, he had steadfastly adhered to civilian control of the military, even when the Congress had not done very right by his army. In other words, he was an eminently respectable and trustworthy person. He'd already won the affection and the trust of the American people, and so he was a natural candidate. But choosing him was more than just a pragmatic decision, because by electing Washington as the president of the convention, which was at first known as the Philadelphia Convention, we know it today as the Constitutional Convention, but it wasn't called that at the time because at the time it wasn't supposed to create a constitution, okay? By picking Washington, you made him the face of the convention, the figurehead of the convention, which reassured everybody across the country. If Washington was in charge, this thing was not going to get out of hand. The next thing that the delegates decided to do was to hold all of their deliberations in absolute secrecy. Now that sounds very undemocratic, but it was a critical component to their ultimate success, which is going to be hard to achieve. By voting to do everything in secret, no press releases, no press conferences, no spectators or reporters in the galleries, the delegates pledged that they are not going to talk about what goes on inside Independence Hall with anybody but themselves. They are essentially keeping the wraps on things until they're done, so there will be a minimum amount of confusion about what their end result is going to be. But the really important thing about deciding to do everything in secret is that they are granting themselves the maximum intellectual flexibility. After all, they'd all been sent there by a state. And the idea was that they were supposed to get the best deal for their state. And if they had done everything in the glare of the public spotlight, everything reported upon, commented upon, it would have been very difficult for these men to think out loud, to roll ideas around in their mind, to propose something, submit it to debate, listen to the debate, conclude their idea needed to be tweaked, or maybe their idea wasn't good, to hear other people's proposals and perhaps initially be in favor of them, but after discussion decide they wouldn't work, or vice versa. This keeps everybody from having to paint themselves into political corners by public pronouncement. And this intellectual flexibility, as it turns out, is going to be absolutely vital to the convention's ability to accomplish its mission. Of course, if they're doing everything by secret, how do we know, and how would the country know what gets done, how it got done, why it got done the way that it did, why something else wasn't done? And the answer to that is that you had some men like James Madison and Alexander Hamilton who decided they were going to take meticulous notes. They were going to write everything down and create a minute record of the convention so that when they finished their business and the time had come to lift the veil of secrecy on their work, the public would be let in. They would know what had been proposed and who had voted for what and what the arguments had been and what had been accepted and what had been rejected and where the compromises had been. And this would help to remove the stigma of secrecy from the convention. So on that first day, these three things sort of got set in motion, and then they were able to turn and pick up the business that they were here to address. And what was that business? Well, the Congress of the Confederation had made that business very clear. Their job was laid out for them with great specificity. They were to alter and revise the Articles of Confederation and render them adequate to the current circumstances of the country. And once their alterations and revisions were approved in the Congress of the Confederation and then approved by all of the states, they would be put into effect. In other words, they're here to fix the Articles of Confederation, not to create something that will replace it, but merely to make it work better, to fine-tune the machine. Very quickly, however, the convention delegates indicated rather boldly that they were of a mind to do a great deal more than that. So they've got one piece of business. How are we going to fix the Articles of Confederation? And the first proposal that was laid on the table was brought forward by the governor of Virginia named Edmund Randolph. He is not the author of that proposal. This is actually something put together by Hamilton and Adams, and especially by James Madison, a Virginian, who had spent the summer reading 400 books on politics and government and political philosophy and natural rights to prepare himself to draft a plan and play a role in this convention. And that's why Madison is often called the father of the Constitution. They were the authors, but these men were controversial. They struck sparks with some people. They were sometimes not personally liked. Their opinions were well known, and those opinions evoked strong reactions. And so neither Adams nor Madison or Hamilton wanted to be the guy to put the plan forward, because they said, hey, look, if I'm recognized as the author, there are going to be people who are not going to give this plan fair consideration. So they looked for somebody who was respectable and moderate and somebody who didn't evoke those kinds of strong emotions. And the governor of Virginia was that kind of a man. Randolph lays the plan before the convention, and therefore that plan comes to be known as the Virginia Plan. The Virginia Plan. And the three big pieces of the Virginia Plan were as follows. First off, it calls for the creation of a two-branch national legislature. So you're going to go from one branch that you have under the Articles to two branches. And one branch, the lower branch, would be elected directly by the people, and the upper branch would be elected by the lower branch. So if we did it that way, the people would elect the House today, and the House would elect the Senate. The second part of the Virginia Plan called for the creation of an executive branch in the national government, and the third part called for the creation of a national judiciary. So the three parts of the Virginia Plan: a two-branch national legislature, half of it elected directly by the citizenry, an executive branch in the national government, and a judicial branch in the national government. And that idea was put before the delegates, and the delegates looked at it and they said, all right, we'll start here. And having decided to start here, they dissolved themselves into a committee of the whole, WHOLE, so that they consider the question. Remember that when a law is proposed in a legislature, it doesn't go to the floor of the House or the Senate and get debated immediately. It goes to a committee with special expertise on that subject matter. And the committee holds hearings where they gather information, and then the committee tweaks, adds, and subtracts to the legislation. And once the committee's done, it either approves it and sends it to the full legislative body for the process to begin all over again, or it rejects it and kills it right there. And so if this is the way the legislative process worked, you're going to follow the same kind of floor plan here, except that there's only one piece of legislation to deal with, and that's the Virginia Plan. So instead of, creating a small committee to work it out and 45 guys sitting around waiting for them to get their job done, just everybody was on the committee. That's the committee of the whole. And as the committee of the whole, they took up the Virginia Plan as though there was nothing controversial about it at all. Now, not everybody thought that, as we're going to find out, but how remarkable that they accepted the Virginia Plan as the basis of their deliberations. And why is that remarkable? Because their job was to alter and revise the Articles of Confederation. Is the Virginia Plan a proposal to alter and revise the Articles of Confederation? And obviously the answer is no. You're going to go from a one-branch national legislature, which is elected by the state governments, to a two-branch national legislature, half of which is elected directly by the people. You're going to go from no executive branch in the national government to having an executive branch in the national government. You're going to go from no national judiciary, no national court system, to having a national court system. This is not alteration and revision. This is major reconstructive surgery. This is taking the Articles of Confederation, crumpling it up, and throwing it away. And yet the delegates said, hey, let's start here. And having started here, they very quickly got into a philosophical debate. over whether or not they were going to create a national or a federal government. Now, to the modern ear, those two things sound the same because we say federal and national as though they're synonymous, but they're not synonymous because a national government is one where all real political power is concentrated in the central government. The state governments in that system are simply administrative components of the national government. They are there to carry out the will of the national government. In a federal system, which is what the United States actually has today, what these men are going to create, is that the national government, the central government, has certain responsibilities like trade and diplomacy and defense and regulating interstate commerce and these sorts of things, and everything else is farmed out to the states. And the states have a great deal of sovereignty. They have a great deal of leeway to run their affairs in their own way. And so we're going to create a federal government, we've got to create a national government. There was a tug back and forth, a lot of argument about philosophy of government and that sort of thing. And this went on for a couple of days until one of the delegates finally got up and said, hey guys, time out, time out. This is all very interesting, but it's philosophical. Let's get back to the real work at hand. We had better create a strong national government now. Because if we don't, within 20 years, we're going to have a dictator because the country is going to continue to drift toward economic collapse, and the states are going to turn against each other, and there's going to be anarchy. We're going to have more things like Shays' Rebellion, and people do not like anarchy and rebellions and revolutions and uncertainty, and they're going to follow anyone who promises to end those things, and the type of man who always ends those kinds of problems is a general on a white horse who's able to rally the masses and the troops behind him, and he successfully puts down the troubles, but at the cost of elevating himself to the role of the indispensable man, and thus he becomes a dictator or a king. So choose. We either begin to really work out how we might make this Virginia plan work, or we continue to argue philosophy and we condemn our republic to death within a couple of decades. Well, that sort of snapped everybody back to the moment, and they began to seriously look at the Virginia plan. Okay, so it's got three parts. Let's take up the first part, this idea of a two-branch national legislature. Okay, we sort of accept that concept that we're going to do this. The first question that comes up is, how will the states be represented in that new legislative body? In the Congress of Confederation, it's one state, one vote, right? In the Continental Congresses, it was one state, one vote. Are you going to maintain one state, one vote, or are you going to come up with a different sort of system? And the small states, the Delawares and the Connecticuts and the Marylands, absolutely insisted that you keep one state, one vote. The bigger states, the New Yorks, the Pennsylvanias, for example, the Massachusetts, said, well, wait just a moment. Is that really fair? Is that actually democratic? Because should a little state with a small population have the same say in the Congress as a big state with a big population? The big states preferred proportional representation. Proportional representation, in other words, a state's vote in Congress is dependent on how many people it has, which seems much more democratic in some ways, but obviously that would benefit the big states, right? Because that would mean that they would have a bigger voice in Congress, and therefore they could, do what they thought was sort of philosophically correct, and it would benefit them. Well, the small states saw that. They did not want to be shoved into insignificance because they were small and because their populations were smaller than big states. It's the same argument that the colonies had made against having representation in the British Parliament before the Revolution. Yes, you could give us representation, but if we do it in proportion to our population, we'll have so few representatives that they won't be able to have an impact. Their presence will rubber stamp whatever the majority wants to do without giving us a real voice. And so the small states wanted to avoid that problem. So the small states insisted on sticking with equal representation, and the big states demanded proportional representation. And here we go, right out of the bat, you hit a stone wall. Neither side is willing to back down. This is going to be the core argument during the entire convention, the great issue that the convention is going to have to overcome if it will succeed. And you've run into it right out of the box. And after a couple of days of argument on this question, it was understood that this was a really bad way to start. You actually wanted to begin by having an agreement. You wanted to make progress. You wanted to show that you could work together. And so the delegates, who were all very smart men and experienced in the issues of government, they decided to table the question of state representation. We're going to set it off to the side. We will come back to it. It still is going to have to be resolved. We're going to table it, and we're going to move on to the second part of the Virginia Plan, which of course was the call for an executive branch. And that was all it said. We're going to have an executive branch. It didn't say what its nature would be, how big it would be, one person, a committee, whatever. So let's take that up. And one of the delegates from Pennsylvania, James Wilson, got up and proposed that the executive consist of a single person. And at that moment, James Madison, who's writing his notes, penned the following: "There followed a substantial pause." There followed a substantial pause. You could have heard a pin drop in Independence Hall, because everybody was thinking the same thing. We've had a government with a one-man chief executive. His name was George III. That had not worked out very well, had it? And how quickly does a one-man chief executive, even if he's elected, go on to become a king or a dictator? Remember the principal lesson of the Revolution: power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. You may elect someone to the presidency or a chief executiveship, if you will, but what guarantees that he will ever voluntarily leave? There was no precedent for that in human history except for one person. And that person, of course, was George Washington. And I think that one of the reasons that this concept of a one-man chief executive was even palatable, was even possible to imagine for delegates in the Pennsylvania State House, was that when you closed your eyes and you thought about who that one-man chief executive would probably be, the picture you saw in your mind's eye was George Washington. So they argued about this back and forth. Edmund Randolph was adamantly opposed. He called a one-man executive the fetus of monarchy. Wilson argued that one person was necessary because it was only in a single person that you could find the needed qualities of energy and responsibility and accountability. I mean, after all, think about this. What human institution does not sooner or later have one person at its head? Every army has a commander, every state has a governor, every school has a principal, every classroom has a teacher, every club has a president, every council has a chairman, every operating room has the chief surgeon, every fire department has a fire chief, every police department has a police chief, and even a family. I mean, no matter how equal your parents might have been, mom and dad might have shared all of the decisions, right? But you knew, and they knew, that when the time came to make the really tough decision, one of your parents, either mom or dad, had a little bit more power than the other one, right? And so you need a one-person executive to make those hard decisions, to be responsible for making those hard decisions, and to be accountable for the decisions that were made. And that argument finally carried the day, and they voted in favor of having a one-man executive branch. Now remember, they're still in the committee of the whole, so they're not casting their feet in stone here. They've got that intellectual flexibility. We'll say that we're going to put this in as part of the plan. We'll build the rest of the plan, and then we'll look at the whole picture, and if we don't like it, we can still change it, or we could reject the whole thing out of hand. So they've made a very hard decision and got some momentum going now. There's progress. So the time has come to turn back to this question of Congress. And when they come back to it, they approach it in a different way. How would we elect the Congress? And everybody liked the idea of the lower branch being elected directly by the people, letting the people have a say in who's running the national government, vesting the people, if you will, in the national government. But when it came time to figure out how to elect the upper branch, well, there were a lot of differences. Nobody liked the idea of the lower branch electing the upper branch. And there were lots of proposals. And what they finally decided upon was to have the state legislatures elect the upper branch. The idea here is that the people's representatives might not be good for government. The people can be, governed by their passions. They can be prejudiced. They can go with whatever the mood of the moment is. They might not send the most temperate, the most reflective, the most capable people to the lower branch of Congress. But state legislators, even though they're elected by the people, generally came from the upper class of society. They were better educated, they were more successful, therefore they were supposed to be more reflective, more prudent, and they would send people like that to the upper branch. And so the lower branch and the upper branch should sort of balance each other. And this gave, everybody kind of half the loaf, and it's a sort of classy compromise. And therefore that ideal sailed through. So again, a little bit of momentum here, a little bit of progress, which leads them back to the concept of how the states would be represented in Congress. And at this point, Roger Sherman of Connecticut made a proposal. He said, why don't we have equal representation in the upper branch and proportional representation in the lower branch? It's logical, isn't it? Who's electing the lower branch? The people. And so doesn't it make sense that the number of people a state has should factor into the votes that it gets in the lower house? But who's electing the upper branch? Well, the state legislatures are electing the upper branch, and since no state legislature or no state is better or more important than the other, then it makes sense to have equal representation there. So this, again, classic compromise. We split the loaf. Each side gets half, and it was rejected. Neither small states nor big states were willing to go along with this. So here we are, back to the same problem that we were stuck on at the very beginning, except now we're about a month in. We're almost a month in, and it seems like this problem is intractable. And this gave an opening to the delegates who believed that the Virginia plan was a really bad idea, who had quietly resisted the concept of the Virginia plan as soon as it was proposed. The men who were certain that they were violating the authority that had been given to them by the Congress, the Confederation, that even if they could come up with a way to craft a government in Independence Hall, even if they could solve the problem of big state versus small state, it was very likely that their work would be rejected by both the Congress and the state governments because they had so grossly gone beyond the bounds that had been put on them. The Virginia plan is not revision and alteration of the Articles of Confederation. It's tearing them up and throwing them out, replacing them with something radically different. That's not what we were sent here to do. And even if that's what we were inclined to do, and not all of us are, even if that's what we are inclined to do, we can't get it done. We can't leap this hurdle of how the states will be represented in Congress. And with that opening, a proposal was brought forward on June 15th of 1787 by William Paterson of New Jersey, and therefore it becomes known as the New Jersey Plan. And the New Jersey Plan basically advocated keeping the Articles of Confederation. It was a true scheme of revision and alteration. So we're going to maintain a one-branch Congress with equal representation of the states and the Congress being elected by state legislature, just like we have it under the Articles of Confederation. But we're going to make some changes. We're going to add some chrome to the machinery. We're going to create an executive committee that will be appointed by the Congress. And that executive committee will not be a body of leadership. It won't have veto or appointment power or anything like that. It will be sort of an administrative body who's going to ensure that what Congress wants done gets done. It's going to be the overseers of Congress's edicts, not the leaders of the country. And then we're going to create a Supreme Court, which will resolve disputes between states. So one of the problems under the Articles is the states are competing against each other and throwing up tax and tariff barriers and that kind of stuff. So now we're going to have a formal court that will look into those issues and resolve them. And if we do this, we're staying within the guidelines we've been given by the Congress. What we're doing is truly alteration and revision. It's very likely to be approved by the Congress. It's not going to be controversial. It'll be approved by the states. And most of all, there's no debate here. We can do this very quickly. We can all go home confident that we have done what we were tasked to do and confident that what we have done will be approved and accepted by the Congress and the states. And when the New Jersey plan was proposed and debated, it seemed to have a great deal of momentum. And in fact, there was much to recommend it if you were frustrated with the roadblock of big state versus small state that kept falling in the path of the convention. A lot of people were having second doubts. A lot of people were beginning to wonder if this thing could get done at all. And the New Jersey plan was a way out. But those who favored the Virginia plan, who favored the idea of a strong central government, understood that if you ditched the Virginia plan and replaced it with the New Jersey idea, that you were surrendering forever the hope of a government that would actually be able to hold the United States together and solve its problem. To accept the New Jersey plan was to stick with the Articles, and to stick with the Articles was to condemn the country to ultimate dissolution and death. But with the momentum in favor of the New Jersey plan, how were you going to get around that? And nobody could even fathom a way to keep the Virginia plan alive. That is until Alexander Hamilton took the Speaker's platform on June 18th. And Hamilton was a well-known proponent of a strong national government. He was one of the authors of the Virginia plan. And he was a man who has a reputation for believing that the ends justify the means. The ends justify the means. And Alexander Hamilton lived up to that, because that day he got up and he looked around Independence Hall and he said, "Gentlemen, let's be honest with ourselves. In this room are 55 of the best and brightest our country has to offer. We've been sitting here with one another for more than a month. We have the ability to look each other in the eye, to openly discuss our doubts and our fears and our proposals and our ideas, and yet amongst ourselves, we have not been able to figure out how we should be governed, how this country should be governed. And if 55 of our nation's best and brightest sitting in the same room cannot do it, how do we expect the uneducated farmer and backwoodsman, the sailor and the shopkeeper and the blacksmith and the peddler to figure it out? And the answer is they can't. The American experiment in democracy was a noble experiment. It was well worth attempting. It was well worth the time and the effort that we poured into it. But let's be honest with ourselves, it has not worked. The common man is in fact not capable of governing himself. And so let us go back to the only form of government that has ever worked, the only form of government that has ever guaranteed the prosperity and the security and the stability that people long for. Let us have a king. Not give ourselves back to George III, but let us elect a king, an elective monarchy, and that king will serve for life, or at least as long as good behavior. And to assist him, we will elect a senate, and the senators will serve for life, or at least as long as they're on their good behavior. And then we can stop this debate about big state versus small state, Articles versus Virginia plan. We can leave all that complicated stuff behind and hand ourselves over to a king. He spoke for almost 4 hours. And at the end of those 4 hours, there was no debate, there was no discussion. They adjourned for the day, and everybody stumbled out of Independence Hall, stunned by what they had heard. Were things really that bad? Had Hamilton really lost faith? When they got back together the next day, June 19th, they didn't discuss what Hamilton had said. It was as though he'd never spoke. Instead, they called the question, are we going to replace the Virginia plan with the New Jersey plan? And the answer was no. The New Jersey plan had been voted down, which was remarkable because basically 24 hours earlier, everybody was convinced it was the Virginia plan that was dead, the New Jersey plan about to supplant it. And yet that's not what happened, and why. And the answer is probably Alexander Hamilton, who may or may not have believed what he said, but by saying it had managed to de-radicalize the Virginia plan. So before Hamilton's proposal for an elective monarchy, you basically had two options on the table. You had the very conservative New Jersey plan, let's stick with the Articles of Confederation, and the very radical Virginia plan, let's throw the Articles away and put something completely different in their place that will create a strong central government. And you give any group of people the choice between doing something conservative and something radical. Especially you give 55 wealthy white men from the upper class of American society the choice between doing something conservative and something radical. They're going to go with conservative 99 times out of 100. In the same way that if you and your friends were sitting around on a Saturday night and trying to figure out what to do, and somebody said, let's go see a movie. And everybody said, oh my gosh, we always go see movies. I'm so tired of seeing movies. Can't we come up with something else? And one of your friends said, I know what we should do. Let's go blow up the state capitol. We've never done that before. It'll be exciting. So if your choice is go see another boring movie or commit an act of terrorism and go to federal prison, it's pretty easy to figure out what you're going to do, right? You're going to go see a movie. But what Hamilton does is he comes in and he puts a third option on the table. And that third option is even more radical than the Virginia plan. And if the New Jersey plan stays conservative, and Hamilton's proposal for an elective monarchy is now the most radical proposal out there, where does that put the Virginia plan? Puts it in the middle, doesn't it? It puts it in the middle. Now, it's not radical, it's middle of the road. And you give any group of people the chance between doing something ultra-conservative, something ultra-radical, or something down the middle is often preferred. So back to our analogy, hey, let's go see a movie, let's go blow up the state capitol, or let's go ride roller coasters. Don't do that all the time. It's exciting, and yet we're not going to commit a crime doing it. That's what Hamilton managed to do. He had saved the Virginia plan. He hadn't solved the problems for the Virginia plan, not by a long shot, and those problems continued to vex the convention. They came out of the Committee of the Whole, reconstituted themselves as the entire convention. They revisited the decisions they had already made, and they reaffirmed them, the one-man chief executive, how you elect the Congress and that kind of stuff. But ultimately, they come back to this question of big state versus small state representation in the Congress. And once again, Sherman proposed his compromise. Once again, that compromise was shot down. And it was clear by this point that the convention as a whole was not going to solve this issue. So as sort of a last moment of desperation, they decided to turn the question over to a special committee. On July 2nd, a committee with 11 delegates led by Benjamin Franklin, the great philosopher, the great politician, the great statesman, the great inventor, the great scientist, the great writer, the great publisher, very old now and not healthy, but still mentally alert and silver-tongued. Franklin was going to be the chair of that committee. And if anybody could smooth ruffled feathers and find a solution, it was going to be Ben Franklin. So the committee went to work, and it spent 14 days crafting a solution to this most difficult of problems. And when the committee made its report on July 16th, it basically came back with Roger Sherman's compromise. We're going to have proportional representation in the lower branch, and we're going to have equal representation in the upper branch. Because that really was the best proposal. It really was the best idea. But Franklin and his committee understood that this had been 3 times proposed and 3 times shot down. So they fleshed it out. Okay, if you're going to have proportional representation in the lower branch, how many people get you a congressman? And they started with 35,000, said then we'll move up to 45,000, 55,000, we'll alter the number as the country grows. But now you could do the math and figure out who would get how many congressmen. And then they made a proposal for people who were afraid that this new government that was being proposed would be too strong. It was going to be able to levy tariffs. It's going to be able to levy taxes. That means it can have an army, it can have a navy. It's going to have a court system, so it could have jails and maybe dungeons and executioners and that kind of thing. So how do we reassure people that we're not jumping out of the English frying pan and into an American fire? Well, one of the things Franklin's committee does is to say that only the lower branch, that is the part of Congress elected directly by the citizenry, can initiate money bills. In other words, before any money can be spent, the people's representatives have to give their blessing, which gives the people's representatives the power of the purse. They can turn off the spigot of money. And why does that matter? Because you don't maintain armies and navies, you don't maintain governments or court systems, dungeons or jails, or pay executioners without money. So if the government begins to act like a tyrant, the people, the representatives of the people, can turn off the flow of cash and shut everything down. Then the other thing that Franklin's committee does is sort of a surprise. It was something that nobody had really thought of, and something that came up when they were talking about congressional proportional representation. And that was the question of whether slaves count. Do slaves count toward getting you a congressman? And here, the position of Southern and Northern delegates is probably opposite of what you're expecting, because the Southern delegates, who owned most of the slaves, or whose region owned most of the slaves, and saw slaves as property, said, well, of course they count. They're human beings. Look at them. Of course they count. And Northerners, who have begun the process of abolishing slavery, no matter how gradually, say, well, no, they don't count. They're not people. They're property. Are we going to count how many horses, chickens, pigs, and cows you have to get you a congressman? No, so why would we count a slave? And if these two positions seem antithetical to what you would expect, it's because they're pragmatic. Southerners want to count slaves because that will give them more votes in the lower branch of Congress. Northerners don't want to count slaves because that will restrict Southern votes, and the North's power will grow in proportion to the amount of power the South is denied. This is a problem, but remember, this is a compromise committee, and this compromise committee is going to find a solution, and that solution is the 3/5 compromise. The 3/5 compromise is the first place that the institution of slavery enters the Constitution and becomes, in fact, part of the highest law of the land. And the 3/5 compromise says that slaves will count as 3/5 of a white citizen for the purposes of determining representation in the Congress. So we oversimplify: for every 5 slaves you have, you can count 3. And that allows the South to count most, but not all of their slaves. And that was acceptable. And so this is put on the table, and it is initially rejected. Even though everybody knows that this is the best compromise you're going to get, this is your last hope, initially no one wanted to accept it, but after a couple of days of argument, they finally decided that this was the only way forward. And this compromise was accepted, and now you've leapt the big hurdle. There were lots of other difficult decisions to make, like how are we going to elect this chief executive who's going to be called the President of the United States? They had to vote 60 times to come up with an answer. There were proposals that the state governors do it, that state legislatures do it, that the whole Congress do it, that one half of the Congress do it, some combination of all of the above, and eventually they developed the idea of the Electoral College, which is one of the most brilliant pieces of the Constitution. The Electoral College is the purest expression of something known as dual sovereignty in the Constitution. Sovereignty is the legitimate wellspring of political power. So why kings and queens are often called sovereigns, because they have the right to rule just because of who they are. But in the United States, we have dual sovereignty. So on the state level, there's no question about who's sovereign, where the authority of government comes from, and that's the people. The people give the state government the right to exist, and that government is there to do their bidding. But what about the national government? Under the Articles of Confederation, the national government was the servant of the states. Under the Continental Congress, the Congress was the servant of the states. We're not going to keep that system now. We're going to have dual sovereignty. So the national government is beholden to both the people and the states. After all, who elects the Congress? Well, the lower half is elected directly by the citizenry, but the upper half is elected by state legislatures. And so half the Congress has to answer to the state governments, and the other half has to answer to the common citizenry, dual sovereignty. And remember that one of the reasons you have this big fight, small state versus big state, is the small states were afraid that they would be reduced to insignificance and impotence. Their voice would be lost, and they would be bullied by their more populist, bigger brethren. And the Electoral College is a way to make sure that doesn't happen. So we don't have one great big national election for the President of the United States, and whoever gets the most votes wins. That's not the way that we do it. If we did it that way, Hillary Clinton would be President of the United States. She got 3 million more total votes in 2016, in the last election than Donald Trump did, 2016. So what we do instead is we have 50 state elections, and every state decides who it wants to be president. And in almost every state, whoever gets the most votes gets all of that state's electors. And every state has a number of electors equal to its 2 U.S. senators and however many congressmen it has. So a big state with a big population like Florida, California, New York, Illinois, Texas has a lot of weight in the Electoral College. And as the Electoral College is initially set up, whoever gets the most votes in it becomes president. Whoever got the second most would be vice president. We changed that in 1800. Now you have to get 50% plus 1 to become president. And the reason that you do this, the reason this is so brilliant, is that it makes sure that your presidential candidates of whatever party or persuasion they belong to have to go out and build coalitions. They have to convince large swaths of the country to support their candidacy. You can't just, if you had a national election, then you could just go to the big cities with the dense populations and get all their votes, and you could ignore small town, rural America, small city America. For example, in 2016, Hillary Clinton won by 3 million votes if you just dumped all the votes across the country into a single bucket. But if you take out the votes of New York City and Los Angeles from that 3 million, then Hillary Clinton actually loses the popular vote by 1 million. So, in other words, without the Electoral College, the citizens of New York and LA would, for most instances, get to choose who's going to be the president. And it wouldn't matter what the people of Idaho or Montana or Alabama or Indiana or Minnesota thought about it. They would simply be outnumbered, and therefore you wouldn't have real equitable representation across a continental country. And this is what the Electoral College was designed to avoid. So another big decision that's been overcome. By July 24th, this thing was far enough along that they could turn it over to a committee of detail. And here is where some other very important decisions and some trivial decisions get made. They decide that they're going to call the lower branch of Congress the House of Representatives. They're going to call the upper branch the Senate of the United States. They're going to give representatives in the lower branch a 2-year term and senators a 6-year term. And every 2 years, the entire House has to stand for election, but only 1/3 of the Senate does. You ever wonder about that? Remember, it's because the Founding Fathers weren't sure how far they could trust the people. The people hadn't particularly showed a lot of civic mindedness and virtue during the period of the Confederation, and the people could be governed by their passions. They could be swept away by the moment, if you will. They might follow whoever was most popular, whoever the most articulate demagogue was, or something like that. So the Founding Fathers say better to limit the damage they can do, and everyone elected directly by the people has to stand for re-election every 2 years. The Senate, which is going to be elected by state legislatures, is supposed to be a more august body, more intellectual, more reflective, more thoughtful, more experienced. They're there to balance the people's house and to provide continuity. So they get 3 times as long in office, and only 1/3 of them stand for re-election at any one time. It was also here in the Committee of Detail that you began to write out the powers of the Congress and the structure of the government, that kind of thing. And of course, one of the powers this new Congress is going to have is the power to levy tariffs and taxes. This government will have the ability to create revenue for itself. And when that was being written out, slavery reared its head again. The slave trade was considered by a lot of people, North and South, non-slaveholders and slaveholders alike, as an abomination. Human beings crammed into the holds of ships so tightly they could barely move, drug across the Atlantic Ocean against their will with very little to eat, very little to drink, and very horrible conditions. There were a lot of people who believed that this was simply immoral and inhumane. There were Southerners who said, look, we've got enough slaves. We don't need to import more. One of the interesting things about American slavery, it's one of the few instances in human history where you had a slave population that grew from natural reproduction. Usually slaves die off faster than they have children. In America, that's not going to be the case. And so do we need the slave trade when we are making so many of our own slaves, so to speak? And there was a thought that the slave trade could be simply taxed out of existence. You put such a high tariff on the importation of slaves that it becomes impossible to sell them profitably, okay? And that was something that some of the Southern delegates absolutely would not exist. Not all of them. There were Southern delegates like James Mason of Virginia who thought that that was a great thing to do. But the others said, no, what you're doing is you're limiting the ability of more Southerners to become slaveholders, to rise in society, to gain more wealth. We're not going to let you do that. And so once again, they had to come up with a compromise. And the compromise was one that, basically split down the middle once again. It was the African Slave Trade Clause to the Constitution. And what it says is that the Congress cannot put a tax higher than $10 a head on the importation of slaves into the country, which is a pretty modest tax. It wasn't going to make new slaves unprofitable, okay? But within 20 years, the Congress would gain the power to abolish the slave trade outright if it wanted to. So for 20 years, you're telling Southerners you can bring in all the slaves you want at a minimal tax. But at the end of those 20 years, the Congress will have the power to abolish the slave trade completely if it wants to. Doesn't mean it has to. It says it's going to have the right to do that if it wants to. And that was acceptable. And of course, what happens is as soon as that 20-year deadline rolls around in 1808, the Congress immediately moves to abolish the slave trade. But this is the second place where slavery enters the Constitution. The third place came out from the understanding that there were going to be free states and slave states. And so the question comes up. If a slave runs away from his master in a slave state, like say Virginia or Maryland, and crosses the border into a free state, such as Pennsylvania, does the slave become free? And in the Fugitive Slave Clause of the Constitution, the Founding Fathers say that the answer is no. A runaway slave is stolen property, even if it's property that stole itself. And just like your horse or your cow wandering away from your property doesn't make them any less your horse or your cow, they should be found and returned. So in three specific places, slavery becomes part of the highest law of the land. The Three-Fifths Compromise, the African Slave Trade Compromise, and the Fugitive Slave Compromise. Interestingly, nowhere in the Constitution will you find the word slave or slavery. Everybody still believes that slavery is dying out. It's just a question of time. It's inevitable. We just don't know when. And so they used euphemisms. For example, imported slaves were such persons as the several states shall see fit to admit. And everybody understood that was long-winded for slave, but it means you don't pollute the document with those uncomfortable, seemingly un-American words. So with all of this worked out, they turned the thing over to a committee of style on September 8th. Here's where the I's are dotted, the T's are crossed, the commas and semicolons put in. And it's here that they work out how the Constitution will be ratified. So remember, the original proposal was alter and revise the Articles of Confederation, submit your alterations and revisions to the Congress. If Congress approves them, it will send them to the states. And if all of the states approve, then they'll go into effect. Well, obviously, that's kind of out the window. They haven't altered or revised the Articles of Confederation, right? They've come up with something completely different. And so if you've taken that bold, radical step, why not go all the way? And they did. So what they said is that this Constitution will be ratified by state conventions. So every state's supposed to hold a convention. When the necessary number of states ratify the document, it will go into effect, and the necessary number would be 9. We're going to require unanimous consent. We're just going to go with 2/3. 9 out of 13 will do it, and the document will become the new governing Constitution of the United States. So they signed it, and they sent it to the Congress of the Confederation, and the veil of secrecy was lifted. The Congress merely called on the states to hold the ratifying conventions, and although not every state governmental body was in favor of doing that, none of them could really refuse to hold a convention because the whole country had been waiting with bated breath for 3 months to see what these men had done and to pass judgment on it. And so now the fight over what is a proposed new constitution goes to the state level, and here it's going to be fought out between 2 factions: the Federalists, who favored ratification, and the Anti-Federalists, who were opposed to ratification. And the Federalists were more numerous, and they had all the advantages. The men who wrote the Constitution were Federalists. They hit the ground running. They already knew what was in it and what the compromises were, what the debates and the arguments had been. They tended to be better known, more highly respected, wealthier. They had the time and wherewithal to go out and make the case for the Constitution. They had the support of most newspapers, which was vital, very important in convincing the public to go along with you. They also had the advantage of all those notes that Madison and others had taken, which were now collected together, simplified, and edited down into something called the Federalist Papers, which are still in print today, and we still refer back to them when we're trying to figure out what the Founding Fathers meant when they wrote the Constitution. What the Federalist Papers did is they completely removed the stigma of secrecy. Now, everything is laid out. The arguments, the debates, the thought process, the whatabouts and why nots, it's all there. And that served to help answer a lot of questions and a lot of concerns people would have had about the Constitution. The other advantage the Federalists have is they've got a great name. Federalist, it sounds respectable. It sounds uplifting. You would want to say, I am a Federalist. The people opposed to the Constitution had all kinds of difficulties. First, they get a late start. First thing they've got to do is get a copy of the thing, read it, and decide they don't like it, and then articulate a reason why they don't like it. The Anti-Federalists were less numerous. They were not as wealthy, not as well known, not as respected. They didn't have the support of newspapers, so it was harder for them to get their message out. The Anti-Federalists also have a rotten name. You never want to define yourself as simply being opposed to something. You want to be for something, right? That's why in the great debate we have in our country over abortion, there's pro-life and pro-choice. Nobody is anti-anything, right? Would you want to run around and say, I'm anti-life? Or would you want to run around and say, I'm anti-choice? Americans like life, and Americans like choice. You don't want to say, I'm opposed to those things. So if you're an anti-federalist, you're simply saying, hey, I don't like what's come out of Independence Hall. I don't have a better suggestion, but I know I don't like this. And that is not necessarily a confidence-inspiring stance to take. The Anti-Federalists, though, did have 2 substantial arguments against ratifying the Constitution. And one of these was a fear of centralized political power, which is as old-fashioned an American fear as the revolution itself. But that wasn't going to work anymore because we had tried a weak central government under the Articles, and that hadn't worked any better than the strong central government we had rebelled against England for. And so that argument's not really going to carry any weight. The better argument the Anti-Federalist had was that there was nowhere in this new Constitution that the rights of the people were guaranteed. Remember, all the state constitutions had given specific declarations of rights. What good does it do for Virginia to say they have the freedom of speech, or Pennsylvania to say they have the freedom of religion, or New York to say that you have the freedom to assemble if the federal government could deny those things to you? And so this lack of a Bill of Rights was potentially the Achilles heel to the argument for ratifying the Constitution. Now, in some places that mattered, in other places it didn't. Some states very quickly held their ratifying conventions and went about codifying their approval of the Constitution. Delaware became the first state to ratify the Constitution on December 7th of 1787. Pennsylvania, after an acrimonious debate, followed suit on December 12th by a margin of 46-23, and 6 days later on December 18th, New Jersey ratifies the Constitution. Of course, it makes sense, right? Pennsylvania is where the convention was held. New Jersey and Delaware are right next door, so the news traveled very quickly. It took some states a little bit longer, in part because they were more distant. By January 2nd, Georgia was in. 7 days later, on January 9th, you had Connecticut. Massachusetts ratifies in February of 1788. And here in Massachusetts, the Anti-Federalists had hammered away at this lack of a Bill of Rights. And the Federalists had responded by saying, give us the government first. And the very first thing that we'll do is attach a Bill of Rights to the Constitution. So government first, Bill of Rights second, and that was a good enough argument to convince the Massachusetts Ratification Convention to accept the document, 187 to 168. So fairly close margin, but Massachusetts is in, and that matters because Massachusetts is the most important of the New England states, and you had to have her. Rhode Island was the only state that had not sent delegates to the Constitutional Convention. It had wanted nothing to do with it. But now that the thing is out and rolling along, the government of Rhode Island decides that it's going to submit the question to its voters. And on March 24th, in a popular referendum, Rhode Island's voters rejected the Constitution. They still want nothing to do with it. Other states, however, are coming on board. On April 28th, Maryland joins, and on May 23rd, South Carolina ratifies. That gave you 8 states, and you had to have 9, and everybody's eyes naturally turned to Virginia, the first colony, the most important of the southern states, the home of Washington and Madison and Jefferson. And in Virginia, there was a big debate over the question. And the absence of a Bill of Rights was a centerpiece of the argument. And you had some powerful voices in Virginia against ratifying the Constitution. Patrick Henry was one of them. Patrick Henry, if this be treason, let us make the most of it. Give me liberty, give me death. Henry was an anti-federalist, and he worried that we were consolidating the country and losing local control. But there were other voices in Virginia like Randolph and Madison and Washington who were even more important than Henry. And on June 25th, Virginia voted to ratify. And of course, Virginia went crazy with celebration, believing it was the critical 9th state. But in fact, 4 days earlier, on June 21st, lowly New Hampshire had ratified, and thus it became the critical 9th state. Virginia was number 10. But Virginia was important because the whole thing wouldn't have worked without Virginia. And that means that you've only got 3 states who are still out: New York and New Jersey and Rhode Island. New York had an anti-federalist majority at its convention under the leadership of Governor George Clinton, and it really looked like New York was going to reject the Constitution. Technically, you did not need it, but if you think about where New York is on the map, if she doesn't come in, you've split the New England states away from the rest of the country. So practically speaking, you have to have New York. The man who saved New York was Alexander Hamilton, whose political power was based in New York City. Mr. Ends justify the means, and Hamilton told the New York Convention that if it wanted to reject the Constitution, that was fine. But the city of New York wanted to accept the Constitution, and it would secede from the state, ratify the Constitution on its own, and become part of the new government. And Hamilton had the political clout to make that happen. And how long could the rest of New York survive without its largest city and its principal port? And so that threat, along with the promise to amend a Bill of Rights to the Constitution, carried the day. And on July 26, New York ratified. North Carolina, again, wasn't necessary, but geographically, if she doesn't come in, you've split South Carolina and Georgia away from the rest of the country. North Carolina took a wait-and-see attitude. On August 2nd, her convention decided to basically neither reject or accept the Constitution. They said, we want to sit back and see what you really do. In other words, prove to us that you're going to put this Bill of Rights in. On between December 15th and January 10th, of 1788, 1789, you held your first election for the president. George Washington, of course, was the overwhelming choice of the American people. On March 4th of 1789, the Congress met for the first time in New York. On April 30th, George Washington, after having been elected by the Electoral College and elected unanimously, the only man in history who can ever say that, took up his duties as President of the United States. He was seconded by John Adams, who became Vice President. With Washington getting all of the electoral votes, they had to vote a second time to come up with the number 2, and that was Adams, but he comes on board. One of the first things the new Congress does is to ask for proposals for a Bill of Rights. There are over 200 proposed amendments. 12 of them go out to the states. 10 of them are ultimately ratified and become our Bill of Rights. And it's in the Bill of Rights that our most important rights are guaranteed by the national government, not granted by the national government. Remember, they are rights that you are born with in American political philosophy, but now the national government is obligated to recognize and to protect them. The freedom of speech, the freedom of press, the right to assembly, protection against unlawful search and seizures, cruel and unusual punishment, the right to trial by jury, and these sorts of things are all laid out in those Bill of Rights. And when North Carolina sees those in process, it says, all right, we're comfortable now. And on November 21st of 1789, it ratifies the Constitution and joins in. Rhode Island is going to hang back until May 29th of 1790. And basically what happens is the United States says, all right, if you don't want to be part of the country, we cut off all trade with you. And Rhode Island couldn't survive without trade, and so it finally voted to come in by a margin of 2 votes. But by the end of May 1790, Rhode Island was in, and the government had been established. The Articles of Confederation were dead. A new constitution was in place, a new government up and operating, and the United States, against all odds, had managed to survive its tempestuous birth. It had gotten a rare second chance. A stronger central government had been created, one that was better organized, one that could levy taxes and tariffs, one that hopefully could better cope with the many problems that the country still faced. How that first government would work, how well that first administration under George Washington would do, remained to be seen, but for the moment, there is opportunity on the horizon. And so we end chapter 6, and I'm going to end it with a couple of questions that you need to answer in an email and send to me. And so the first of those questions is, what was the last state to ratify the Constitution out of the original 13? The next question, who proposed an elective monarchy at the Constitutional Convention? And the third question is, what event convinced the states to send delegates to Philadelphia? What was the event that scared everybody so much that they agreed to send states to the Philadelphia Convention? And so what's the last state to ratify the Constitution? Who proposed an elective monarchy at the Constitutional Convention? And what event so scared the states that they agreed to send delegates? And so email those three answers to me, as well as the questions, and in addition to the three questions posed midway through this lecture, and that will be part of your next test. So we will continue with these video lectures until they let us back onto campus. Your next test, of course, has been postponed for a week, April 14th, and what I will be doing is I will be posting your essay questions on Blackboard, emailing those to you, and you will have a week to type up a one-page answer and email it back to me. I hope you all are doing well. I hope that we are able to sit in the same room with one another before the semester is over. But until then, this is the end of our first video lecture.